Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Wise Tech for Wise Money. I'm Gary Wayne, founder of A1 Solutions. We work with founders, leadership teams, and businesses to improve efficiency, scale intelligently, and grow through smarter use of technology, systems, and operational strategy. Today's episode is titled Closing the Action Gap: Why CEOs Struggle to Execute and How to Fix It. Today's discussion is about something that affects every business: execution. Not a lack of ideas, not a lack of intelligence, but the gap between knowing what to do and actually doing it. I'm joined by Rob Salter, executive coach and author of The Action Gap, who works with CEOs and managing directors to help them turn knowledge into practical results. Hi Rob, it's great to have you here today.
Thank you.
Hope you're
I'm
doing
delighted
well.
to
Hope
be
you're
here.
enjoying the sun.
Absolutely. Nice to meet you.
Let's start with your background. Uh, you work right directly with CEOs and MDs,
I
people
do.
who are already experienced, already knowledgeable. How did you get to what you're doing and decide that this was, a role that needed fulfilling?
Yeah. So I spent the first half of my career working in big businesses. I think my last proper job was with Tesco. I left there in about 2013, and I'd had a career working with quite big organisations as a senior manager. And then when I left them, I started to take managing director and CEO roles in smaller companies. So quite a broad experience of the roles that I'm now trying to assist with, and it could be a reflection of how tough I found it when I became the managing director. But you quickly realise that there is no school for MDs. Most people are thrust into those positions, and you can't get a diploma in it or anything like that. So you've got to make it up as you go along. And my experience of my own experience and that of others is that leaders get very little help and frankly very little sympathy. People assume, oh, well, you're the managing director or the CEO, you must know what you're doing. And a lot of them do, of course. But there's not a lot of sympathy for those roles. And actually, in my experience, they're all trying to do their best. They're all trying to provide for their families, for themselves, for their workers. I mean, the great quote, the quote I loved is, "A good CEO is somebody who takes more of the blame and less of the credit than they should." And I think that's, if you talk to anybody that's in those roles, they would agree with that. Um, I'm not saying they need sympathy. It's a great job, but they also need a bit of help. And so what I've focused my second half of my career on is providing them with that help.
No, I think that's excellent. I mean, I've been an MD of a couple of businesses when I was in employment, and you are between the rock and the hard place. You're trying to please shareholders and upper higher management. At the same time, you have a team to look after as well as yourself, and obviously there's a lot of conflicting issues, and sometimes it's very hard to get anything done. Moving on to where you are now, and you wrote your book, The Action Gap. Let's get straight to that. Explain, when you say the action gap, you've worked with people who have read everything, seen everything, understand everything, but they're just not applying any of that knowledge. Tell me a little
Yes,
bit about that.
I will. So the idea of the action gap was sort of born over a number of years, and I'd sort of loosely come up with about 12 different things that I thought were relevant. So if I was trying to advise a leader what to do to bring some of this stuff to life, I had about 12 things that I thought were relevant. And if I'm really honest, I don't think I was ever going to write the book. It was sort of there. And in fact, friends had kept saying to me, when are you going to write that book? When are you going to write that book? And I sort of blew it off. And then 4 years ago, unfortunately, I had quite a devastating health issue. I had a subarachnoid brain hemorrhage, and it damn near killed me. And I ended up in hospital for 10 months. I was on a ventilator. I mean, it was a mess. I was a mess. But the amazing thing about it, and certainly one of the chapters in the book, is how you get good from bad. And there was certainly nothing much worse than that. But the idea of trying to see the good in the bad immediately got me thinking about were these 12 things that I've been banging on about all these years, were they actually of any value to me in recovering from my brain hemorrhage or not? So the action gap is really it's my idea of what really works in business, but it's looked through the lens of my brain hemorrhage. So each of the 12 chapters talks about what it is. It then says, was that any value to me in my brain hemorrhage recovery? So it's an opportunity for me to talk about that, which was both cathartic for me and hopefully interesting for the reader. But the Himalayas of the book is saying, all that being said, this is what I think you should read, this is what I think you should do. And it's a deliberately short book, because what I didn't want to do is create a book called The Action Gap that then takes 3 weeks to read.
Sure.
So most people who have read it say they can read it in a couple of sittings, and that's deliberate on my part. I didn't want it to be a hugely long book, or frankly, an attempt to do a better job than some of the people who've written about a particular topic. So a great example of that would be the Start With Why series by Simon Sinek. It's a fantastic book, and in fact I recommend in my book that anyone who's interested enough in it should read that book. Mine isn't an attempt to do a better job than Simon, not that I could, but it's my attempt at, the Americans call it the skinny. So there's a short piece about what Simon's talking about, but the real meat of the book is about how that helped me get through my brain hemorrhage, but more importantly, what I think leaders should be doing with it day to day.
Excellent. I mean, yeah, we'll ask a bit more about that in a moment. I'd love to just touch base on how your brain hemorrhage came about and how difficult it was to recover.
Yeah. Well, the honest answer is I don't know, and no one really knows. And in fact, with most things like that, it sort of comes out of the blue. There's no particular warning. It's like a heart attack. Somebody says, well, maybe your lifestyle wasn't great, maybe you did things in your early life that led to it, but obviously a lot of people have things like that, and unfortunately the vast majority of people that have what I had don't make it. And in fact, if it weren't for my wife being there that night and calling the ambulance when she did, had the ambulance not turned up in 7 minutes, which it did, the time between me having the hemorrhage and getting to the operating table was quite short, mercifully short, because like all things like that, whether it's a heart attack or a stroke or whatever it may be, time is not your friend. So I was I hate to use the word lucky, because having a brain hemorrhage doesn't make you lucky, but I was lucky in the sense that a lot of things lined up for me that gave me a fighting chance. All that being said, in part of the research for my book, I found my notes from the ICU back in 2021, and they had me marked down with a 7% chance of survival. I don't know where they got the 7 from, but I was very aware, even then, I was very aware that I was pretty close to death. And one of the nurses who looked after me, who was fabulous, by the way, in the ICU, this was in November when it happened. I woke up in December, just before Christmas, and the nurse that was looking after me went off for a Christmas and New Year holiday, as you do. She came back in the middle of January and she was jumping for joy. And me being a bit thick, I didn't really twig what it was about. She was saying, oh, you've made my Christmas and New Year. And I was thinking, well, that's funny, I haven't seen her for a few weeks. Of course, I now look back on it and realise that when she left me in the middle of December, she didn't think she'd ever see me again. She was absolutely convinced that by the time she got off her holiday, I'd be dead. So they didn't give me a great chance, put it that way.
So how has this affected your outlook on life?
I think it's made me. I think the stories of every day's a bonus and I appreciate my life. I don't think it's quite that. I still get quite grumpy and I can still get angry at the TV and all the rest of it. I don't think I'm, every day's a bonus kind of guy. But I'm aware of my own mortality, and I'm aware that I've only got If I'm lucky, I might have another 20 or 30 years. Um, but that's my opportunity to make a difference, to leave a legacy, not in monetary terms, but if I can share my experiences and I can help other people, that's my ethos.
It leads you to do the role you do.
Yeah.
So, moving on to that role, what is it that stops intelligent, capable people from executing effectively?
Yeah, well, I think it's a combination of things. I think what we're seeing today is a growth in learning. So it's a good thing that people are much more focused on learning than they ever were. People are reading books, watching podcasts, signing up to online courses, and you can't help thinking, well, that's got to be a good thing. But when you look at the growth in learning and then you compare it to the action's not really moving. So all of that learning is not resulting in action. And like all these problems, like all these issues, it's no one thing. But I think there is, I mean, I'll mention Simon's book, the Start With Why book. It's a fabulous book. I'd encourage anyone to read it. But there's nothing in that book that talks about this ain't easy. It's going to be challenging. You'll get a lot of incoming negativity from your team. And you won't be confident enough not to give up long before you get to the finish line. And so what I think happens is, and this is a sort of paraphrasing, but somebody goes on a course or reads a book and they're all enthusiastic about it for 2 weeks. And then after 2 weeks, they forget about it. And in fact, even their employees and their staff will say, oh, don't worry, he'll be over it in a couple of weeks. And that manager, that leader who is all enthusiastic when they've been on the course, and everybody knows that within a couple of weeks they'll have forgotten about it and they've moved on to the next thing. So this sort of knowledge junkie, excited about the learning, but makes no reference to what you're going to do with it. So that rather rude question, the sort of so what question that I often ask people, hopefully in a polite way, they look at you like, well, what do you mean so what? I said, well, what are you going to do with it? And they don't know. I met one guy a few years ago. He's probably the poster child for this, but I was working with him as his coach for about 6 months. And every time I quoted a book or a thing, he said, oh, I've read that. And after about 6 months, I sort of jokingly said to him, do you know what? One day I'm going to quote a book or a piece of content that you haven't read. And he sort of looked at me and he was bristling and saying, well, good luck with that. I've read them all. And he had. And another 6 months went by and I still hadn't managed to quote something he hadn't read. And then I was sitting in his office one day and I said, do you know what? I said, please, if you tell me I'm wrong if I'm wrong, but you've read everything that I can think of. You've read it all. You've learned everything. But you've done nothing. There's no evidence that I can see of any of that learning resulting in action in your business. And he sat for a while and thought about it and he said, well, yeah, now you say it, yeah, you're right, I haven't done anything with it. And that set me on a journey. Everybody I worked with, not quite as bad as him, but everybody had that action gap. You know, there's a great saying, when all is said and done, a lot more gets said than done. I love that phrase. Because I'd say that it's endemic in business.
Talking about business, and yeah, there is an action gap, but business is tough. I think a lot of people they learn, they educate, and they don't go through the motions or actually follow through on everything because, as we know, you hit so many brick walls and so many negatives. It's very difficult to get clients. It's difficult to do business. It is difficult to make money. Obviously, once you get to a certain level, then it obviously just flows because of referrals and recommendations. But I think initially, a lot of people, they learn, they educate, they try to apply, hit brick walls, and then feel like they can't get any further, so they give up. How do we overcome that? How do people who have read and learned, how do they fill that action gap when they've actually hit so many brick walls?
Well, what I try to do, if you when you read the book, you'll see. So take Simon Sinek. I mean, I'll go on about Simon because his book's called Start with Why, so it's not a bad place to start. It would be a bit obtuse if it was at the end of my book. But Simon's written a wonderful book called Start with Why. The problem with, and I haven't met anybody yet who's read that book that doesn't agree with it. It's borderline. You can't argue with it. It's a good book. And the principles it supports are good as well. In fact, I'd go as far as to say that they are essential in business. The problem is that when you hear someone else's why statement, it sounds like they must have taken about 5 minutes to come up with it. But we all know from our own experience that every why statement takes about 9 months to come up with it. Sure. And when you've done it, you'll look at yourself and say, oh, why did it take me 9 months to come up with that? I should have thought of that on day 2. So the gap between, so when you're looking at Start with Why, and you see all these fantastic why statements, and then you try and apply it in your own business, and you think, well, I can't think of one. Maybe there isn't a why. Maybe my business hasn't got one. Then you've got colleagues who are saying, oh, I'm not sure about this why thing, because they've not been on the course, they've not read the book, so they're a bit skeptical about it. So the leader who read the book, who thinks it's brilliant, suddenly starts to say, well, maybe it's not that important, I'll just move on. So that's a great example of everybody reads it and everybody loves it, but very few people actually do anything with it. There's a massive gap. So when I work with people, I say, look, this is not going to be easy. If this gets really hard, if you get a lot of incoming from colleagues, stick with it. Keep going. Don't think you're unique. You know, you're not different to everybody else. In fact, you're the same, me included. So I try to bring a little bit of encouragement to leaders to say, look, be brave, be bold, stick with it, even when other people around you are saying, no, I don't want to do that. You need to be steadfast and stick with it. You don't need to give up after 2 weeks, because if you do, nothing will happen.
In your journey, what do you find the real challenges CEOs are dealing with day to day?
Well, I think what's interesting about, so SMEs in particular, I think my joke when I was in big businesses like, you know, Tesco and people like that, is that I used to say you get a lot more help than you really need. You know, people are sort of lining up to help you and advise you, and you're surrounded by literally hundreds of people. When you run an SME, you may have a small board, you may not. You may be a family business, you may be a founder. You may have a couple of, you might have a couple of kids in there. You might have a kind uncle that will help you. But a lot of SMEs are very thin on governance and leadership beyond the CEO. And so it's quite a lonely position to be in. And what I find is a lot of CEOs, when you ask them, who do you share your ideas with, who do you talk to, the answer is hardly anyone and not much. So I think it becomes quite an isolated position for a lot of leaders. I mean, they can go home and talk to their partner or kick the dog, but they don't really have a lot of people that they can genuinely share their ideas with. And I think a good coach, I heard a phrase a few years ago and it sort of stuck with me, but this person said, every conversation we ever have is really with ourselves. It sometimes involves other people. And as a coach, what I think my job is to help the person figure it out. It's not my job. So if I was a consultant, it would be my job to tell them the answer. But as a coach, it's not my job to do that. It's my job to help them answer the question, be the mirror, to be able to say to them, well, what about this or what about that? So a good coach will always help the person they're working with figure it out. And when clients say to me, oh, I've never thought of that, I've never said that before. So you're hearing it for the first time, but so are they. And I know I'm onto something when a client says to me, oh, I've never thought of that before, I've never said that before. Oh, that's really interesting.
Where's the crossover between being a coach and consultancy?
Well, I think I find myself quite often in situations where a client will say to me, look, just tell me what to do. I don't know what to do, just tell me what to do. If that happens, and I think it's appropriate, I will say to them, look, I'm going to take off my coach's hat for a minute, and I'm going to put on my consultant's hat, and I'm going to give you some consultancy advice. Consultancy is about telling people what to do. Coaching is about trying to help people work out what to do for themselves. There's a clear distinction between coaching and, I suppose, the bit in the middle is mentoring, where you're sort of half coaching and half consulting. A mentor is somebody who tries to facilitate the thinking in the same way. But a pure coach's job is to say, look, it's not mine to figure out, it's yours. My job is to help you figure it out. Whereas a consultant, you're paid to come up with the answers.
Okay. So where do you see the biggest disconnect between intention and execution?
So I think the biggest gap is that most of the learning talks about whatever it is, but doesn't really acknowledge any of the practical difficulties of it. It even goes as far as to say they even avoid the practical issues. I'd say my style is to say, look, there are practical issues. Don't be fooled into thinking this is going to be easy, because it's not. But here are some techniques that I think that really work for you. So, for example, there's a chapter in my book called Conscious Competence, and it basically says when you walk through the door in the morning, you need to be conscious every minute of the whole day. At no point can you be on autopilot. And that's why I think, if you do that for 8 hours a day or 9 hours a day, the minute you walk in the door to the minute you leave, you're consciously competent. Everything you do and say is deliberate. That requires a huge amount of energy. And I'm recommending that people do that. Get yourself prepared to be consciously competent at all times.
So how great is the fear of failure versus distraction or lack of focus, or just too many priorities?
I think they're both big. I think interesting enough, I spent a couple of years working in America, and I think Americans have a slightly more a healthy view of help. But I think if you're appointed as a CEO or as an MD, there's a slight reluctance on the part of those people to say, thank you, you've just appointed me as the MD and the CEO, but I need a bit of help. Because there's a fear that their employer might say, well, hang on a minute, we've just hired you as the CEO. Aren't you supposed to know everything? What do you need help for? So there's a slight reluctance amongst that population to admit that they need a bit of help. So if a managing director says, look, I need to get in a coach to come and help me figure out a few things, they're slightly nervous that the business might turn around and say, well, that's disappointing. We thought you knew all of that. So the acknowledgement that help is needed is a challenge for a lot of CEOs and MDs. It's lonely at the top is, obviously not in all cases that's true. I find working with family businesses really challenging, because usually the business has been founded by somebody who's grown the business and done an amazing job, and they're then ready to pass it on to their children who were born with a silver spoon in their mouth and have had everything given to them, and they're expected to suddenly take over a business that they're not really equipped to do. Helping family businesses navigate that minefield I particularly enjoy, because it's a real challenge, and there's a lot more at stake than just a business. There's a whole family, the family relationship. So I enjoy working with those people as well. But I'd say the universal challenge for any business leader is you get a bit stuck in your own head. And if the only voices you ever hear are your own, and you don't get anybody that would challenge you or question you, one of the problems of being the MD or the CEO is that everybody thinks everything you say is fantastic and everything you say is wonderful, No one says, well, that's a load of rubbish, that you don't need to do that. They get used to thinking, they get used to that world in which nobody really challenges them. A good coach will politely come along and say, look, have you thought about this? So when somebody says to me, look, I've got a problem with my sales director, and I say, do you think it might be you? That starts a whole conversation. So my job as a coach is to challenge them a little bit nicely. I don't want to fall out with them or get them to, I want to keep the business, but I also want to challenge them a little bit and get them to question everything.
So you said you work a lot with families. I mean, in the States, obviously there's a lot of family offices, and they don't call it a coach; they call them advisors. And the advisors sort of put together or help manage the teams of CPAs, RIAs, or in our language, accountants, legal, financial advisors, etc. Is that sort of a role that you participate in with families?
Well, I tend to work. I'd love to say that I do, but the family offices that I work with aren't quite the size that you're describing.
Sure. But it's
They
the
might have
same
a couple of,
mechanics.
they might have a couple of million, but not 200 million.
Yeah, but the mechanics are roughly the same.
Yeah, I think the biggest challenge for family businesses is that they've grown up as a family business founded by the founder, and there's a lack of corporate governance in place. And as the business has got bigger and bigger and bigger, they can't, and they want to hand it on to little Johnny or little Sylvia. The children couldn't, even if they wanted to, they couldn't carry on running the business like dad or mum would run it. And they don't have the governance to run the business. So the challenge for the business is you can't carry on as you are. You can't just hospital pass it to your kids and walk away, because it will be a nightmare. You need a board, you need governance, you need all those things in place, and they don't have them. So I went out a few years ago. I'm actually a qualified company secretary, because when company secretaries were first invented in the 40s, it was a bit of a bag carrying job, really. Since then, it's become a lot more strategic, a lot more of a key role, really, on the board. But so I offer those services to my clients and say, look, what you need is a good company secretary. You need a board, you need good governance, because if you hand this on to your children without that in place, you're setting them up. Well, in the extreme, they could even end up they could end up in the dock. I mean, I heard
Company secretaries cover a lot of law,
yeah,
a lot of commercial, obviously, qualities as well. So it's a very well-rounded professional qualification.
Yeah. So I took it upon myself to become one of those about 5 years ago. And since then, I've been able to offer my clients plenty of advice on the corporate governance question. I mean, I don't know how true this is, but I heard a stat that something like 10 directors a week are jailed for misdemeanors of one kind or another, mostly financial, I would say. But there's a steady stream of directors going to jail. And the only two questions that ever matter, so if you ever find yourself in the dock, the only two questions that are key are, did you do your best? And did you do everything that could be reasonably expected of you in the role as the MD? And if the answer to either of those questions is deemed to be no, you could be in a load of trouble. So I'd say it's beholden on directors to always do their best and always do everything that they can be reasonably expected to do. And I'd say a very large number of company directors not only do not really understand their role, they don't understand the jeopardy that they're facing, and they don't really, in the nicest possible way, they don't necessarily know what they're doing. So I was talking to somebody the other day about, there's a myth in the world that limited liability, I've got limited liability. And I have to say to them, no, you don't. Your company does, but you don't. There's no limited liability for you. Your company might not need, your company will be treated in law with limited liability, but it won't apply to you. And I think most people think it does, only it
Yeah, I
doesn't.
think you're right. I think a lot of people have that, yeah, conception that if they're in a limited company, they're actually protected.
Yeah. And, they are, to some degree they are, but their personal liability. So if your company goes bust and you've borrowed £100,000 from it, there's no limited liability. The administrator will come after you for that 100,000. And it's worse than that actually, because if there are three directors and you the one that's borrowed the 100,000 but you haven't got the money, the administrator will go after the other two directors for the money because you're jointly and summarily liable for everything. So if I always say you're only as strong as your weakest link. So if one of your directors is a bit of a rogue and is borrowing money and running fast and loose with the company funds, if the day of reckoning ever comes, you'll be in the dock alongside him. And if he's got no money and you have, they'll come after you for it. Hopefully none of those things will happen, but my impression is that very, very few people truly understand that. And it's not my, I mean, it's not, I mean, I remember years ago, I was listening to a woman who was, I think she'd been made director of the year, and she was director of about 6 companies. And she came to talk to me and some others about what it takes to be a director. And we broke for coffee at 11 o'clock. And I half jokingly said to her, does anybody ever come back after coffee? Because you've scared the bejesus out of us here. And it was just one story after another. And she said, oh, don't get me wrong, it's the best job in the world. I love it. I wouldn't be a director of 6 companies if I didn't believe that. But I'm telling you, most of the people that I know that are directors of companies don't truly understand their role and their liabilities and their responsibilities. And I have to say, in all the years I've been doing this ever since, that's more true than even I thought.
So, in your journey and your role as a coach,
Yeah.
and obviously addressing the action gap, how do you get your clients to address it, to fix it? What practical steps can leaders take to close that gap between knowledge and action?
Yeah. So what I normally do is I say to them, look, we can't solve all the problems in the world or even all your problems, but tell me what your top 3 challenges are. What are the 3 things that you would love to be able to solve, whatever they are, and tell me why you haven't done it so far. So what's difficult about that? What's stopped you solving it? What's got in the way? Is it fear of what might happen? So, for example, if you knew that whatever you did would work, what would you do? So I start this journey of looking at the challenges that they're facing and trying to get them to see what the possible solutions are with a view to taking action. It's a very practical process and very simple, but it's about saying to the person, look, you've obviously got these 3 problems. You've had them for a long time. You haven't dealt with them. How can I help you do that? How can I unlock that problem? And a good coach, well, I'd like to think I'm a good coach, but a good coach will always help you with that. Help you to solve the problem. It won't solve the problem for you. It's not their job. The job is to help the other person see the problem and solve it. So if I say things like, what are you pretending not to know? Some people look at you and say, what do you mean, what am I pretending not to know? I say, well, there's clearly something here that you're choosing to ignore or pretending not to know. So it's a silly thing, but if you're overweight and you're pretending not to know it's because you eat too much, that's a real problem. The reason people are overweight, and I include myself in this, the reason people are overweight is because they eat too much and they don't do enough exercise. Everything else is detail. But if you're sitting there saying, oh, I've got a glandular problem, or I've got this, or I've got that, you've given yourself a load of reasons why something is. But the real reason is you eat too much and you don't take enough exercise. Getting somebody to acknowledge that and then do something about it is really what the coach's job is there to do. And
So,
I'd like
in
to think
this,
that I'd take a very practical approach to these things. not in a judgmental way. It's not my job to judge them or to be disappointed that they haven't done anything, but it's also not to, make it okay and just swerve it and not deal with it.
So in this world of crazy social media, high technology, all these new skill sets that people are learning, and everybody seems to be following them and learning about them, how do you help them fill the action gap between learning about technology, all the sites, and how you can actually increase visibility to actually doing stuff? Because I find that a lot of the people I talk to and what I do, they understand how quickly the world's changing, but they don't seem to know how to get there or fill the gap or take steps to do it.
Yeah, and again, I don't know this because I'm not them, but I suspect that a lot of the learning is, oh, I can't deal with that problem, and I'm too busy because I'm learning this new thing. So the new learning is almost an excuse for not doing something about the stuff they've already learned. So when I meet a new client, I say, look, if there are knowledge gaps that need to be filled, I'll help you fill them. So if I think there's a course that you should go on or a book you should read, I'll always refer you to it. But I'm willing to bet, and I don't know this, but I'm willing to bet that there is more nourishment in us looking at what you've already learned and deciding what on earth we can do with it than there is in learning something new. And it's not an either or, because you need to keep learning.
Sure.
I'm not discouraging learning. What I am discouraging is using learning as an excuse for not doing anything. Oh, I'm too busy, I'm on a course, or I'm reading a book, or that's all good, but it's not an excuse for not doing anything.
So how do we generally fill the action gap?
So in the action gap book that I wrote, I'd like to say that the things that I'm telling people to do are incredibly practical and stuff they can start doing tomorrow. So if I said to somebody, when you walk in the door tomorrow, be conscious throughout the day. Don't ever switch off. Don't ever say anything or do anything that you weren't fully cognizant of. You need to be consciously competent. There's a whole thing in there around truth. So trust is something that I'm saying you should give before it's earned. So there's a whole army of people who believe that trust has to be earned. You start with none, and then if I know you for 10 years and you're a good person, I might trust you. I'm saying that makes perfect sense. I get it. But actually I'm asking you to turn the whole world on its head and give that person that you've just met trust from day one. And even trusting me to get you to do that takes a lot of, it takes a lot for them to do that, because their instincts are all, well, that's mad, I wouldn't ever do that. You've got
But
to
it
learn
actually
my
makes a
I'm not gonna
difference,
give it-
doesn't it, between actually accomplishing and not? Because if you say, "Oh, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to take that guy on. Or I'm not going to do that contract, or I'm not because I don't trust them or I don't know them," you don't do anything. You never get anywhere.
No. So if, for example, if I said to them, look, so if you met 10 people, how many of them do you think would be worthy of trust? You don't know them yet, but what's your guess at how many of them would be good people that are worthy of trust versus those that aren't? I mean, it depends what they say, but let's say they say, well, 8 of them would be trustworthy and 2 of them wouldn't. I just don't know which of the 2 are. So I said, I get that. So what you're going to do is you're going to mistrust all of them. So the 8 people that deserve your trust are going to feel, well, great, this guy, I'm worthy of his trust, but he hasn't given it to me. The 2 people that are no good will take advantage of your trust, no question about that. But your focus should be on those that are trustworthy, and you need to deal with the untrustworthy swiftly and quickly. So on the face of it, it sounds like trusting people before they've earned it is stupid and weak, but actually it's clever and strong. And the gap between the 2 perspectives is huge. So when I meet a really strong manager who's built their career on, I don't trust anybody, they've got to earn it, telling them that that's not right, that they need to start with trust and accept that some of the people will let them down, that's a huge journey. And in fact, I learned over the years that some of the dumbest things I heard, like that, like somebody once said to me, you need to think of your boss as somebody that works for you. And I was actually quite cross when they said it. I said, what, you need me to treat my boss as if they work for me? That's mental. I'm not going to do that. And yet over the years, that's percolated through me to now be one of the more profound things that I've learned. So whenever I hear something that sounds a bit off, I always automatically say, well, hang on a minute, let's just, let's not rush to judgment. But that takes time and patience and...
But it makes sense.
Yeah.
So if we could, just before we wrap up, if we could change three things, in how leaders operate, two, in how businesses execute, and how people turn
I
knowledge
just
into
ask you to... My dogs are barking for some reason. Guys, quiet, please. The
Sorry, if
dogs
we
just
could
suddenly start barking for no reason.
the
Let me just
action
close
there.
my door, just 1 second. Always happens at the most inconvenient of times.
Yeah, of course.
Sorry, you were saying.
That's right. If you could, before we wrap up, if you could change three things, that how leaders operate being one, and how businesses execute being two, and how people turn knowledge into results, what would you do?
I would say every leader should start with why, should have a really clear understanding of not what they're doing, not how they're doing it, but why they're doing it. I think it's profound and transformational when you know why you're doing something. And I'd say coming up with a why statement for yourself or your business is a lot harder than you think, because when you look at someone's why statement, when they've got one, you'll wonder how it took them so long to come up with it. But I'll tell you now, they did. And I see most people giving up before they get to their why statement. So I'd say encouraging people to keep going, even when it's tough, to that point where they've got a real understanding of. So if I said to you, what do you do? You could tell me. If I said to you, how do you do it? You could tell me that. And if I said, why do you do it? Generally, the reaction to that question is they'll say things like, well, I do it for the money. And I say, no, beyond the money. We're all doing it for the money. I've had some amazing jobs over the years, but I wouldn't have done any of them if they didn't pay me. So it's not about money. Why are you doing what you're doing? And quite often they'll say, well, there is no why. I've just sort of drifted into it. And I have to say to them, there always is a why. You know it, you just can't articulate it yet. And so I take them on a journey of discovering their why. So I'd say coming up with a really clear why is very important.
Excellent.
Conscious competence, I'd say, would be a lot harder to achieve than you think. So being consciously competent all day, every minute of every day, Monday to Friday or however many days you work, that takes a lot of energy and a lot of focus. But I believe it's an essential thing for you to do. So I'd definitely pick on those two. And I'd say the third one is, again, something I learned from when I was at Tesco. I worked for a very smart guy called Terry Leahy. And chapter 1 in his book was all about truth and how the world is constructed on accepted truths that aren't actually true. So the whole of human history, the whole of almost any subject is an accepted truth that may or may not be true, but quite often it's not true. And what Terry was very good at was saying, even when the truth seemed accepted and obvious, he would be the one that'd say, I'm not sure I believe that, keep going. And it's socially unacceptable to do that. It's annoying, because everybody just wants to get out and get on and get home. And he's the one going, no, I'm not sure I quite believe that. And having the guts to seek out the truth is hard, but worth it.
Okay,
So
cool.
so a great example of that was, going back to the Tesco example. So they had a problem. It was about 2008, so it was in the height of the banking crisis, and they found that the bigger stores, the extras, weren't doing as well as the other stores. And there was quite a lot of head scratching going on as to why the big stores were doing disproportionately poorly. And they hired a bunch of people to go and look at the problem. So they came back to the board and they said, oh, we think we know why. It's because these stores are further away. And because petrol is so expensive, people are choosing to stay local rather than go to the extras. Brilliant. Obvious. Everybody thought that was the right answer. Everybody thought it was amazing. And we thought about, should we run a promotion on petrol? Spend 50 quid and get 5p off a litre of fuel. Brilliant. And then Terry then stopped everybody and said, sounds good, but how do you know that that's the case? And the honest answer is they didn't. They just made it up. It was a plausible, accepted truth. They'd all decided amongst themselves that that was true. But when Terry started questioning them about how they knew that, the honest answer was they didn't. So Terry said, I'm not sure that's right. I want you to keep going. And it wasn't very popular. I mean, I was in the room and I didn't find it very popular. I was sitting there thinking, God, can't we just say it's that and go home? So him having the guts to keep going, to keep looking for the truth, to keep digging, to keep the resolve to find the real truth. I'd say those, if I had to pick three things, I'd say those three were my three.
I think, I'm very pleased we did this podcast. The action gap actually resonates with me. I interview a lot of people, and the one thing I've noticed about success is the people that have got action gaps are not so successful as the people that don't. And I say that because what I found is a lot of people, they want to learn before they take action, and then they don't always take action. But the really successful people I've met are people that have taken action many, many a time without the knowledge, and then picked up the knowledge and learnt the knowledge on the journey. And by taking that action immediately, they have been very successful.
Yeah, I think the living with the slight ambiguity of saying I don't know everything and I could be wrong, but I'm not going to let that get in the way of me making a decision. So based on what I know now, this is what I'm thinking of doing and this is what I'm going to do. I'm open-minded. I could be wrong, and if you can persuade me I'm wrong and that happens, I'm always open to that. But I won't say to myself, I don't know enough to make a decision, so I won't make a decision. You have to be able to make a decision, but also accept that you might be wrong and you might learn something later that helps you. So I think it's a good thing to be able to make a decision based on what you know and not say to yourself or others, I'm not going to decide because I don't know enough. And I think that's the problem that a lot of people get stuck in, is that they'll say, oh, well, I've got this new thing to learn. I can't do anything until I've learned that. I'm saying, yeah, well, I'm not sure if that's right, really.
Yeah, no, you're right. Well, Rob, I want to thank you for being on the podcast. I hope you've enjoyed being my guest and found the chat. I'm glad you're over your illness. I think you're a brave man to talk about it and to have got through what you have. Where can people find you, if they want to learn more about your action gap and your services, etc.?
So I've got a website called saltant.co.uk, which is, if you Google saltant.co.uk, my website will come up, and in it's got the book and all of the services that I offer. So you can pretty much find anything that you want to know by looking at the website. And it includes things like my telephone number and my email address and all of those things. So I'd be thrilled if anybody were to reach out to me through email or even just picking up the phone. I'll be happy to talk to anybody about my work or about the services that I can provide or the book.
All right, excellent. Thank you. Well, I'm now going to sign off. I want to thank you again, Rob, for attending.
Thank you.
And being my guest. I'm Gary Wayne from A1 Solutions. This is Wise Tech for Wise Money. You can get a hold of me via LinkedIn on my website, www.a1solutionsinternational.com. That's INTL at the end. And once again, thank you for listening in. We'll be back in the next day or two with another episode of Wise Tech. Thank you very much indeed, everybody. Thanks, Rob.
Cheers.